Now, Roma Wines present Suspense.
Hi everybody, I'm Walden Hughes, and I have two guys who've been friends for a long time, and they're dangerous together. Keith Scott and Joe Webb, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walden.
How in the world did you two guys meet?
Oh boy, we met in a day that your listeners or your viewers probably can't even comprehend. It'd be like from another planet. We met back in the analog days in the year 1980 when Joe had a company called Old Radio Warehouse, and from 14,000 miles away, I used to order reel-to-reel tapes, and he'd send this huge box that then took 6 months by ship to reach Australia. So we lived on another planet on a galaxy far, far away.
Yes. Well, and to be more technical, we've never met until 2019.
Right.
In June, when we visited the Thousand Oaks library and their holdings of the KNX scripts. So that was the only time that we had met. We spent parts of 2 days together, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it was about 4 days you were there in total, and we also did an interview at the hotel where we
that was great fun.
Background,
yes.
and particularly had a chapter on suspense, which is our topic really for today.
I knew Keith 15 minutes. I'm already asking him why Australians like Vegemite.
That's another suspenseful question.
So that was it. But we had known of each other for a very, very long time. And when I left the hobby from around 1985 to around 2006 or so, Keith and I reconnected on Facebook, and it's
right.
And gosh, it's like we talk every day, either by text message or do a Facebook video. It's just been absolutely terrific.
Yes, yeah, no, it's we've certainly built up a lot of knowledge in that few years since we reconnected, and much of it really has been about suspense. Joe's doing this incredible daily blog, and I'm doing a log that I'm adding to fact by fact. So it's been kind of a lifelong thing. If you're talking about suspense, for instance, it was, I think, the first radio show I ever heard. A friend of mine sent me a tape of Three Skeleton Key, the 56 version with Vincent Price, and the 57 Line Engine versus the Ants with William Conrad. And that really got me hooked on old-time radio back in the year 1971. Believe it or not.
About you, Joe, when the first suspense you recall hearing?
Oh, I could not say, but I know the one that made the biggest impression on me was on a reel that I traded with Bob Burnham. I was just basically collecting reels, not always listening to them. I was in college, and I got a reel that had 3 o'clock on it, and there I am. I always multitasked, so I always had some radio program in the background, and that was one of the shows that you started to realize what was going on, and you just had to stop to really appreciate all the little subtleties in that performance. And that is absolutely my favorite suspense episode. The performance is just incredible, and the story is marvelous.
It's an amazing story, and I'd say the only other one I say would have had a similar effect on me, and that I use to sometimes play to people who've never heard an old-time radio show before, is the first version of Dead Earnest with Wally Mayer.
Sure.
Again, that again, just I had to drop everything and I had to hear how that episode resolved itself, and it showed you the power of just an audio medium with a bunch of actors around microphones and a couple of sound guys behind them and someone in the booth, and yet you're seeing pictures in your mind of something that's happening,
Right.
And but I would say if Joe says that 3 o'clock is his favorite episode of suspense, I still say my favorite has always been the 1942 Hitchhiker with Orson Welles, because that
Mhm.
truly was the show that got me on collecting full series of these shows that I wanted. You know, like I had to get every Suspense after I heard The Hitchhiker.
Sure. I did not hear that one until much later.
Right.
And
Right.
it is funny going through these episodes for a daily blog or near daily blog, one by one, and listening to them again. Now that you and I have studied more of the backstory of the series, you
Right.
start to pick up a lot of the inside jokes and understand the relationships of the people in them. So, in The Hitchhiker, when that one scene. Well, I can't listen to the show without chuckling now. That
Yeah.
one scene where he is alone near a farm and you hear the cows bleating and mooing, and he says, "I was utterly alone." And the sound effect is not on other performances on the other series. It's just so, it's the typical inside jokes that Wells and Spear would have pulled on each
Yeah.
other there. But that is a fantastic story. It's just it's marvelous.
That got me also hooked on the idea of the writers, because I couldn't wait to hear who'd written it. And when it was Lucille Fletcher, and then I found out, a couple of years down the track that, of course, her most famous one was Sorry, Wrong Number. It just it got me interested in the history and becoming a Sherlock Holmes, investigating the background of who was behind each season and who was William Spear and who, and so it becomes this lifelong study, because you're still learning about things. Joe is now finding out things about each individual scriptwriter who may have just contributed one episode over the whole 20 years. And even doing research like that leads you to links about similar shows that they did for a series like Murder by Experts in New York, or a film noir script that they wrote. And so there's all these connections, and it really, by doing it that way, it takes you back to the 1940s, and you can put yourself in that era and kind of really understand where everyone was coming from.
When did most of the recording start to pop up in the hobby? Was it the 70s? You guys, can you guys?
Oh, it was in the
pinpoint that?
1960s. It was the 1960s, definitely. There were people like Pat Rispoli, who was a very, very important collector in the late 1950s, especially for sports broadcasts. He worked in the court system in Albany, New York, and was recording Brooklyn Dodgers games and Yankees games and others that were picked up there, mainly on station WROW. And he was also collecting Johnny Dollar and Gunsmoke and Suspense and trading them very, very actively around the country. And it's because of him that so many of those series that were after the transcription discs in the tape era, where networks were recording over things that they had done in studio with other shows, that those programs are preserved.
And as old as we are, there was this generation who came before us that seemed like grandparents in our image. George Fowler was a guy I bought stuff from, and he's a guy who's long gone. And Skip Craig bought stuff from him. He's credited in Dunning's second book. Don Aston used to call him Grumpy George, but he apparently found, or was privy to finding, just where a lot of shows came from that weren't from the big stashes that CBS, donated to Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters.
Right. It's interesting. One of the things old time radio researchers is doing right now is we're finding a lot of pioneer hobbyist collections, and as we go through their reels, there were a lot of air checks that they had, even from the 1940s, where they stumbled on those discs at radio stations or sources that were not Los Angeles based. So you can find many of them there. There were a lot of Armed Forces radio discs before the big recording from Pacific Pioneers. So there was a lot of interest in Suspense.
Yes.
There a lot of them were air checks. Some of the copies of Donovan's Brain that were floating around prior to the good copies being transferred were really noisy, lots of station interference and the like. So they really put up with a lot in order to do what they were considering to be the saving of that particular era.
Right. And also some of those collectors not only used the very first domestic reel-to-reel machines, but they were using those manufactured home disc cutting machines. I think they were up to maybe 12-inch blanks, and they could record off air. And that's where you hear a lot of those occasional finds of a Sam Spade that sounds not great.
Right.
And of course, the primitive method of cutting commercials or musical bits out of variety shows on those machines was you just lifted the tone arm up and put it back down on the disc as it was cutting.
So and there were dictation equipment that was being used. If somebody was a lawyer, they let's instead of dictating today, I'll record Suspense or Jack Benny. Wire recorders, and some of those home recordings have never been replaced. We've never found the transcription disc of those anywhere. So,
and then of course the other great find, of course, was the years and years of various stashes of Armed Forces Radio Service copies. Because sometimes they're the only copies of shows where the network episode has disappeared into the ether.
We've found over these past 10 years, there was only I think, if I'm remembering correctly, there's only been one network copy of a missing Suspense broadcast that was found. It was the second performance of Burning Court, and it was put up on eBay at one time. All the other ones that we've been finding are AFRS recordings.
Right.
So things like Spoils for Victor, the original broadcast of that, Fury and Sound, the roast of Bill Spear. That's an Armed Forces recording. So those Armed Forces recordings were not liked by the early collectors. They felt that there was something lesser about them.
Impure.
Oh yeah, because all the commercials were taken out. Any other kinds of network announcements were removed. And the thing was, they felt negative about them because that was not the way that they remembered hearing radio. They wanted that full experience of the network broadcast. And the generations of collectors now are looking at them. This is the only way that we can fill in. And in some cases, this is the only way we can get a clean recording of that particular drama. So it's interesting how that sentiment toward Armed Forces Radio recordings has changed over the decades.
Yes, and now a lot of the early Armed Forces recordings from way back in the 70s were scratchy and badly stored. And then it took another 10 or 15 years to find collections of AFRS discs that sounded incredibly clean. And of course, that has been the big find.
Yes.
And especially now that you're going through some of these deceased old timer collectors collections, some of the shows that we used to, thank God for these home tapers like Johnny Dollar and Suspense. Now you're finding closer to source ones of the same episodes that actually sound really good. For many years it was assumed the only copies of the home recordings were going to be terrible, and we had to live with them.
It's been really neat going through this one collection, Ron Bowser's collection, but it's also from some others. Pat Rispoli turned on his tape recorder and just let it play for the full hour of Johnny Dollar and Suspense on WROW. So he traded those full hour air checks that he was making, and you would get all of the commercials of Albany, New York, the car dealers, the toy stores, the public service announcements, and the like. And now I think the number that we've been able to find in these collections is somewhere around 45 or 50 of
48,
them.
I think. Yeah.
And they're just fun to listen to, because you're not just listening to the particular drama, you're listening to the way radio sounded in 1960, 1961, 1962.
And it was easy, I guess, in one sense for Pat Rispoli as a hobbyist, even though he worked in the court system, because by then, the era he was doing this valuable work, he saved hundreds of shows, but that, of course, was easy simply because it was only Sunday evening that had drama left by that period of radio.
Right.
Every other day of the week was just news and music.
Yes.
Yeah.
When did CBS drop transcriptions and went to tape for Suspense?
This is a complicated answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I would say, well, tape really was being experimented with in the late 40s because of Bing Crosby, and they could
absolutely.
See and then by the time Elliot Lewis took over, he was one of the proponents of recording the actors at a separate time to the music, because very soon after that the rates went up for musicians, and it was easier for them to come in and do live. While the actors were being played back at the broadcast time off tape, there were holes left for the musicians to fill in with their live music cues by then. So that was part one of the story. That was the reason for that being that if the musicians had recorded, the recording rate had increased to the point where the budget of the show couldn't take it. And then by 56, when Bill Robeson took over Suspense, tape was by then so commonplace that they used to have the industry expression, this is a tape operation. Bergen and McCarthy's 1 hour show, all of these things, especially a lot of those NBC dramas during their Silver Jubilee, were straight to tape by then. And so by 56, not only was the dramatic stuff done on tape, but everything was done at the same time on tape, and the engineers were spinning music cues in at the time of the actors recording their performance on tape.
Right.
Yeah.
There's another key factor in all of that. As you get out of the 1940s and into the early 1950s, this is when Lewis was there. The demand for actors to be on television and also on movie sets was made it very difficult for radio broadcasts, especially of Suspense's quality, which wanted stars in their shows, to meet their schedules and meet their needs. So as you go through the production scripts of many of those Lewis years, you will see that they're recording shows on Saturdays, on Sundays, late at night. I think there's one missing program, Deadline, with Broderick Crawford. Now, Crawford was known as a real party guy. I don't remember if the rehearsal started on Saturday night and then they did the recording and wrapped up at midnight. I mean, so they were doing all kinds of things to make sure that they could continue to get the bigger name stars on the programs. Now,
some of those scripts you can actually see little hand penciled notes by Elliot Lewis or Bill Spear, where it said call back so and so was the agent for this actor, because they maybe had a hole in the filming schedule where they could do a radio show, and it was like often you'd hear a star's name announced coming next week, and then that all fell through because schedules were mixed up. So suddenly it was another star subbing for the star who had been announced.
Yes,
it was,
and all that basically ended. All the shows that once you're in the Lewis era and they're using more and more tape, you rarely see changes in the announced star not showing, because they would just delay the taping to another time and slot somebody else in. I've always thought it was interesting as Bill Robeson as a showman, because in his first time back after being in CBS exile, when he's the producer of Suspense, he makes a really big deal about Suspense switching to full production on tape. And Anthony Ellis and Norman Macdonald and Elliot Lewis were all doing all kinds of things with tape before that, but Robeson tried to make it sound like this really big deal. There is a missing sorry wrong number from 1952, and I found a newspaper article about it, and the article explicitly says that they were watching the tape recorders in the pre-recording of the show. So that would make the 1948 performance during the Anton Leader era of Sorry Wrong Number the final time that the Moorhead did that live.
Live, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And in 1952, at that performance, which was the beginning of the season, the article was talking about all of the newspaper people, the critics and the writers, being in the audience as they watched the show being recorded.
Yeah, I think they were behind glass because there was obviously on a drama,
Yes.
it would be very silly for them to burst into applause or laugh at something that might have been a humorous
And we want to make sure all journalists are behind or under glass. So
behind bars in many cases. But
Talk about the business side of Suspense. I mean, it had pretty much two major sponsors, Roma and Autolite. But a lot of years, it didn't have any sponsors at all. Talk about the business and the budgets and things like that.
Well, the idea right from the beginning was to get a sponsor for Suspense. And, and when after the, what do you call it? The pilot that was on CBS Forecast in 1940, when they shopped the show, there was such disappointment about the way that broadcast had gone that the advertisers really didn't trust the format. So they reformulated the show. It took a lot of infighting behind the scenes to get Suspense on the air in 1942. And they decided to go ahead with it as a sustainer and in hopes of finding a sponsor. It took a little time. Colgate was going to be a sponsor as of summer of 1953, which didn't happen.
Yeah. But back in 42, when they first put it on, shopping it around as a vehicle for a potential sponsor when it was a summer series, it didn't attract a sponsor. And there was a few of the board members at CBS who thought, all right, well, that's the end of that. But strangely enough, there had been even over summer when it's assumed that people aren't listening, there'd been an enormous amount of positive mail sent to CBS in New York. And they could see the future again because it was like, well, people are telling us they really like this, so we're going to renew it and let's see if it goes for a fall season. And sure enough, during that coming season was when they were doing a lot of the behind the scenes things, and Roma Wines became their big sponsor. Right. The end of 43.
Right. Shenley had purchased, I forget the brothers who had owned that winery. Shenley had purchased that winery or that business sometime in the summer. So the management wanted to make sure that they got off the ground running by promoting the use of by promoting their products on a very, very big important vehicle. And they chose Suspense. They were sponsoring other things, but the whole Hollywood star thing captured their attention. And
it did,
and as I look more at the wine business of the World War II wine business, when you really listen to some of the commercials with Elsa Maxwell and the scarcity of certain food products, especially, and making things like bean casserole, and somebody would laugh at you today and say, what wine goes with bean casserole? Wine was a way of dealing with the pressure and the psychological issues of scarcity and the war and bad news.
Itself,
it really did liven up a really drab meal.
Well, and again, a drab time in people's psyches, as you say. That's why there were so many of these wildly over-the-top comedy variety shows like Abbott and Costello, who screamed their lines more hysterically than they did in the movies, because it was escapism, pure escapism at home, to take your mind off this horrible war that was being waged.
Yeah. So then Roma started to realize in 1946 that they were spending a lot of money And the post-war wine business was not as good as anyone really expected it to be. So they were becoming concerned about it. And by the beginning of 1947, they were making a lot of noise about not renewing Suspense. And that's when Dead Earnest, the program you like so much, which William Spear did not like, but Kay Thompson loved, right, and convinced him to do it. That's when it won the Peabody Award, and that's when CBS was able to embarrass Roma into two more contract renewals. To see, with the publicity of Peabody and the economy improving for the post-war era, that they should just stick with the show, and they didn't. They just couldn't.
Well, it went for it's essentially they gave it another 6 months on air, and then finally pulled the pin. And by that point, they were already crazily starting to look for a new sponsor, and which ended up being Autolite. But then there was that interim period where negotiations were happening, and of course that was the period of the 1 hour suspense that went for 19 weeks. And even Variety pointed out that from the first of the 1 hour shows, they hit the nail on the head as to what was wrong with the format. It just sounded like, especially the fact that the first of the 1 hour shows being sustained was the Black Curtain, which had been done very well 2 times previously. It sounded to Variety's reviewer, and I think to the listeners, that the material was just being padded out to 1 hour. And Suspense really, with the great format of Bill Spear and Anton Leder, and the great work that they did, really did work as very edgy little half-hour presentations.
Now, Suspense was basically canceled after the last Roma show, and there was like a 2 or 3 week period where CBS executives were huddling whether or not to cancel it or whether or not to try to reformat it. And they were always pointing toward Lux Radio Theater. And what a big ratings winner Lux was, and what an incredible relationship that series had with its sponsor. And they wanted to try to duplicate it in an hour-long format. And most of those hour-long suspense were rushed because there was no original written for 1 hour script until near the end of February. Everything else was either retooled, or that one time they repaired the August Heat and the Wet Saturday together, because it was like they were scrambling around trying to figure out how do we fill an hour.
And also I think the third one was because of Bill Spear being involved in those first 5 weeks of the 1 hour show. There was a rehash of a 1 hour or Sam Spade that was originally done as a 2-parter of Sam Spade, the Candy Tooth Caper.
So it was during that time that I think we now know that Bill Paley was working behind the scenes to kill the 60-minute show by having discussions with Autolite and their ad agency, and Paley was so powerful that he actually got Autolite to change ad agencies so that they would sponsor Suspense. And part of that whole negotiation was that Autolite would also become a sponsor of the Suspense TV show. So that they would get the whole package. So the Autolite years are different than the Roma years. Definitely, they had the change in strategy to have some of those historical shows that they would have some dramatic insight to later on, and the Autolite era ended when the car business went into recession in 1954. And they pulled the plug on both the radio and TV show, even though TV's ratings were really good. They basically said that was enough. We can.
And the radio show did survive, pretty well, way past its use by date, because there were many sponsored radio series that were starting to be cancelled in the year 1950 to 51 season. That was when television really had proven itself to be the future, and radio, as much as they denied it, for the next 10 years was on every year the budgets kept shrinking, and up to the famous year of 62. And the whole industry was not in denial, but just hoping it kept hanging on for a few more years.
Well, one of the big advantages Suspense had was that it was an anthology program,
Right.
so they could change the actors and well, anybody else on the production staff every week to keep it going. They didn't have to rely on one particular star going from week to week. And so while there were rumors on a fairly regular basis that Suspense was going to end, it was always something else that was getting canned. And Suspense just kept on going.
Yes.
Which movie stars were really good radio actors?
Sonny Tufts. No.
No.
Now cut that out.
Oh gosh. Cary Grant was terrific.
Cary Grant, yeah, he was great. He was unexpectedly good because, again, there's that screen image of Cary Grant, and then the fact is that a lot of these actors, it was publicized, wanted to do Suspense after the Roma years became very well established, because Bill Spear was a real bon vivant and understood actors, and they really got on well with him. And also, all of these actors were attracted to Suspense because it was the only scripts in town that gave them the opportunity to stretch themselves, and their screen image could be put to one side, and Boris Karloff could play a very likable person, for instance, or Cary Grant could play a killer or a menacing person, or somebody you think could be, the only time he ever did that on screen was in Suspicion for Alfred Hitchcock. So a lot of these actors were just terrific on Suspense.
Yeah. Jimmy Stewart,
yes,
Van Heflin.
Stewart and Heflin were particularly good on it.
I was
of course,
surprised.
Joseph Cotton, of course, he was.
Gosh, yes,
of
absolutely. Well, and it was interesting. Some star would cancel out, and Spear would just call Cotton, and he'd come in and without all the advance rehearsal or whatever, and just do an incredible job. Yeah,
and he'd been a friend of Bill Spear since the March of Time back in New York in 10 years earlier. So there was that relationship with him and Wells. But so many of them were just so good on radio. Dan Duryea, who had that great voice for film noir, where he was known as the heel with sex appeal and the misogynistic sort of villain, and he'd play in a crazy show like The Man Who Couldn't Lose, which Gene Kelly had first done, which was one of those plots that almost had you laughing at the audacity of the author, but it was just one disaster after another.
He is terrific in that.
Yeah, he is. Yeah,
and Lovejoy, of course.
Oh yeah. By the 50s, well, even the star system had changed in Hollywood because of the encroachment of television. So it wasn't as big as movies weren't as big as they were in the 30s and 40s in the grand scheme of things. But by the 50s, Elliot Lewis particularly was dealing with the agent Don Sharp, who had all of these actors under contract. And that's why you hear multiple appearances by people like John Hodiak and Herbert Marshall, Jeff Chandler, Frank Lovejoy, I mentioned Herbert Marshall, and Robert Young, time after time, or Richard Widmark in particular.
Sure.
Widmark again, because he'd started as such a good radio actor in the very first couple of Suspense shows. Richard Widmark appears in a couple of them, and way back in 42. And then, of course, once he became known in movies as Tommy Udo in Kiss of Death, he was just he could be even more over the top on radio, with that you're a big man, you're a real big man, aren't you? That crazy, unpleasant, sadistic villain that he played, So
what would lunch be like with Dan Duryea and Richard Widmark? I mean,
yeah, I'm gonna pick up the tab. It's mine. I'll get it. No, you won't. You won't be a big man about this. I'm getting a tab. That would be a Suspense show, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
Widmark and Duryea.
So, what movie stars sort of struggled doing Suspense?
That's an interesting question, because Spear always targeted scripts toward the abilities of that
Yeah.
particular star, and sometimes the inabilities
Yeah,
of them.
we did find
Yeah.
that Sonny Tufts wasn't very effective as a radio actor. Neither, strangely enough, was Gloria Swanson in that
Mhm.
New York one, where
Mhm.
she keeps stumbling over many things. So I think a lot of them, and especially, of course, don't forget those were screen actors who weren't radio people really in to the core, as some of them were, and of course the shows were going out live, which gave them the absolute jitters in the pre-tape days. But then by the 50s and the tape era, you wouldn't hear a bad performance because they could be, re-recorded, and I think by then they were just choosing people who just loved the medium of radio and would do it at scale, even though they'd been big movie names like Herbert Marshall, and Vincent Price just adored radio till his dying day. Kind of like a star version of Hans Conried, who championed radio, over TV. That famous quote of Hans Conried where he says, "Wouldn't it be great if TV was leaving and radio was just coming in?"
I have a nomination for the worst actor in a strangely good suspense episode, and it's The Brighton Strangler with John Loder.
Sure.
Yeah,
That
Sure.
is because if anybody has seen The Brighton Strangler, it's an
Right.
incomprehensible, weird film act with the lead actor basically being a tree the entire film. But the radio version, he doesn't change much of his performance. He's still kind of just there, but the story works out better than it does in the film.
Yeah.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. Although Loder, I guess, was one of those British guys that unfortunately had a naturally constricted, stuffy sort of sound to his voice anyway. So I don't, if you get a good British voice on Suspense, like a James Mason or something, and it's like night and day,
Yeah. If you ever for a film to watch is The Man Who Changed His Mind, John Loder is up against Boris Karloff, and it's just like, oh, you're doomed. You're doomed.
Yes. Karloff had that charisma. Yeah, there's no denying it.
Yeah. I guess he was married to Rita Hayworth, though, so I guess it worked out for him somehow. Or no, not Rita Hayworth, Hedy Lamarr. That's right. Yeah, Hedy Lamarr.
That's right. He was too, and she was the lady who never did Suspense, strangely enough, although she did do Screen Guild and a few other shows. We did find there were at least five male actors who didn't do. You tend to think every star did Suspense, but Spencer Tracy didn't. Neither did John Wayne, Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, and a couple of others. And it's like I wish they had, in one sense, because it really did stretch some of these actors and prove that they were. Oh boy, I didn't think so and so could do that. And then you hear it and you think, my God, really good.
There's a question within that is when comedy stars go on Suspense, it ends up being a love or hate scenario, kind of more or less, because there's some Jack Benny ones that people love, and then there's ones that they don't like at all.
Plan X was more like an experiment, I guess, but and Red Skelton. See, from the very first, Charlie Vander and then Bill Spear wanted to do that thing of stretching actors, and one of the things that they had actually talked about was, let's have comedians play dramatic roles that you'd never hear them play. And from the very first episode, Charlie Ruggles was cast as in The Burning Court. Mind you, the guy who wrote the script for that, Harold Medford, privately said to a very early collector, John Scheinfeld, I thought Ruggles was horribly miscast, but that's just a personal opinion, So, but generally, it was always interesting if you did hear a comedy person on Suspense, especially somebody big time like Benny in Murder in G Flat, where he's the little piano tuner. Very, very good episode.
Do you have like a particular favorite that may not be Jack adjacent, like of one of those comedians that went out and stretched themselves to the limit?
Personally, I liked Red Skelton in 1949, The Search for Isabel. I thought it was so unlike Skelton with those crazy characters, the mean little kid and all of that, that it was like, boy, he really proved he's. And then, strangely enough, maybe not a comedian, but I thought an excellent performance was given by Ralph Edwards, the host of, Truth or Consequences and You Bet Your Life on television, in The Ghost Hunt. That one had me riveted like Dead Ernest had me riveted.
What about you, Joe? Anything stand out in that field, or
Nothing comes to mind right now. I do think it was funny though when Benny did that Faces Familiar.
Right.
That there was a complaint by Autolite that this wasn't a good suspense script. So Lewis supposedly showed him the coffee mug that had the Fred Allen line on it. Where were you when the page was blank? You know, so kind of thing. And Benny loved the script so much he bought it and did it on General Electric Theater, which his production company was doing.
And I remember when the writer Richard Petticini told me about Benny doing A Murder in G Flat. He didn't have the last joke in it, and when they were rehearsing it and going over it, they were looking for a Jack Benny-esque ending, and that was when Petticini had the brainwave, and Benny approved it on the spot of Jack Benny right at the end of the episode when it's all a happy ending and he's been proven that he's innocent. He goes to call his wife and say, "I'll be home soon," and oh sure, there's a phone booth just in there, and he asks the chief of police, "Oh, listen, yes, Mr. Benny, here's a nickel." And then the suspense music just comes up very softly.
I gotta listen again. I gotta listen to that again. And that's what's marvelous about these things. We can listen to all these things again and again and again and find all kinds of subtle things in the performances.
Well, even Breakout, I think at the end of 48, William Bendick's episode, again, a little bit like Pearls Are a Nuisance, where he played a light-hearted role instead of his mean film noir character. And Benny came on to do a tiny plug because that was the week that he was changing over from NBC to CBS. And he said something that I can't remember right now, but it was just a typical Jack Benny joke. And William Bendick suddenly broke character, and they could hear him burst into laughter, laughing at Jack.
Walden,
Talk
are you?
about the influence of the different directors of suspense. Just each one sort of had their own feel and their own pacing. Talk about each of the directors.
Well, definitely, yeah. I'll mention Bill Spear because I think the Roma Wine shows a reflection of him. It was very well known that he favored very little rehearsal compared to somebody like Bill Robeson, who believed in heavy rehearsal. And Spear's idea was that it would get all of these movie stars that he had a good off-stage relationship with, a little nervous and able to do a slightly heightened performance because he loved melodrama and music. And Bill Robeson disparaged that. He said, "I didn't believe in that approach," but he said, "I can't deny the fact that I still think Bill Spear really was the person behind the success of Suspense."
And Robeson himself had great freedom by not having a sponsor.
Mm-hmm.
We know of certain scripts that were changed or canceled by Autolite, and one of them is Celebration. A collector, John Barker, reminded me of this a couple of years ago. If you listen to the two stories, the one done under Anton Leader with Robert Young, is this ending is sanitized and almost laughably impractical or implausible. And it's actually about a murder suicide in a car, and Robeson did it in its full misery in 1957. So he was not afraid to violate a lot of supposed rules from the 1940s and do what he needed to do in the 1950s. And I think one of the things that he realized, even though Suspense is definitely not a kids show, you had more than one person around the radio in the 1940s, and by the time Robeson takes over, it's one person at the radio. And that's one reason why his introductions were so effective, because he's talking to that one person. It also meant that the dramas could be handled in a much, much different way, and be much more serious than prior times.
Yes, and in the William N. Robeson years, from 56 to 59, the last of the Hollywood years, you'll notice that the budget is a lot lower than, say, the glory days of the 40s, where it was all these huge orchestras and live things. Here it's music cues on tape, but very adult in terms of, especially that Long Night episode with Frank Lovejoy, which
an incredible story.
Very much a downer, no happy ending, and done twice. And I think Robeson favored the story, and you do get some very unusual shows in that period. Of course, you also get Bill Robeson being able to reuse on Suspense some of the great shows that he did on Escape, which originated there, such as Three Skeleton Key and Lion Engine, and of course they become part of the legend of Suspense as well.
Sure. Well, the audience had changed dramatically in that time. When you just look at the television viewership, you had a totally different audience listening to radio at that time. Now, as far as the Elliot Lewis years go, it's a little spottier. You could see Lewis struggling. How do we hold the audience in the face of television? And he does a lot of experimentation.
Oh yeah, even Shakespeare, even a
and I described it to someone. Lewis is going all Columbia Workshop on us, and rather than giving us suspense. So
that's why he did those musical shows like the Wreck of the Old 97 and Frankie
and they should have stopped with that one.
Well, that was a good one, but some of them were, you could tell they were stretching a bit in the wrong direction. But again, I think these guys were such radio people that it was in that feeling of, they grew up in the 30s when radio was a grand experiment, and they were still experimenting in the 50s because they just loved the medium. It was a few of these people, and especially William Frug, who was quoted as saying that there were some of us, even after TV had been established for about 8 years, in the mid-50s, he started the CBS radio workshop. He said, some of us, to tell the truth, we didn't care about going into TV. We loved radio, and we knew it was a dying medium, but we were going to stick it out, by God, so that's unusual to actually hear that expressed.
Frug was a top CBS executive. It's not a familiar name to a lot of folks, and he wrote some of the Columbia Workshops, didn't he?
He did. He wrote some of the CBS. He started as a junior writing Jeff Regan Investigator when Frank Graham took it over, and couple of Rocky Jordans and things like that, but basically he became an executive, and he was the guy who championed all these shows and gave them extra years of extended life, like Suspense, and he kept Escape going for a couple more seasons than it was deemed, and various of these things, because he liked the people like Norman Macdonald and Bill Robeson. He was a great fan of Bill Robeson, even though he could recognize he was a nutcase behind, once he got into the studio, he was like a tyrant. But
now I said when McDonald took over after Lewis left, he's kind of just keeping it status quo.
Yeah, he was a staff guy.
Yeah. Anthony Ellis, one of the most talented people ever to be in the studio and at the microphone. All his Suspense are a little spotty as well. And then Robeson comes back, and then the decision is made to go back to New York. And that first year when Paul Roberts is there, and he was an experienced radio drama producer, I think he was really trying to keep it all together and keep it going in a very special way. And then we get into Bruno Zerato Jr. and Fred Hutchinson. And was there anybody else that was?
No.
Anton, we got Anton.
As far as I'm concerned, the Anton M. Leader year is the best year consistently of Suspense. He was not liked at all. A lot of the old-time actors really thought that they had earned a position of respect, and he wanted to find other new actors. He didn't get along with the CBS executives, and so he was gone after a year.
I think he had a big argument with Guy Della Chopper, who was very big on the board, and he was a guy you didn't argue with. Or if you were one of the guys who knew how to play the game, like Bill Spear, you could make your points in a more politic way than Leader did.
Yeah.
So he was gone, and that's when Elliot Lewis was chosen by Bill Spear to take over.
Yeah.
In 1950. But yeah, they all had particular feel to them, but you'd have to listen to many shows of each person to make up your own mind as to what that particular feel was, but it's noticeable. It just reflected each director, as a man.
The last year, Hollywood versus New York in the 60s, could, besides the voices of the actors, was there a different feel with the production themselves?
Yes.
Well, yeah, the budgets were
minuscule. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there were the Paul Roberts year, I think, is the better one of that time, because he was trying to work hard to make keep the respectability. After that,
he also had done some great work on CBS Radio Workshop when it was
because CBS
New York Hollywood.
Yes, so he was known to everyone, but then when after his year, because he left when Suspense was canceled, November 1960, and they decided to stick with Gunsmoke and Johnny Dollar, and then it's when Bruno Zerato Jr. comes in, and to hear
once Gunsmoke's canceled, that's right,
So and Keith had a friendship with John Scheinfeld, who interviewed many of these people in the early 1970s.
Yeah, he got to a lot of people that had gone by the time SPERDVAC started, so it was fortunate. Yeah.
So Zerato was talking about how the budgets were just absolutely terrible, and one of the things he liked about the New York actors, who were still very, very busy in the theater, on television, commercials, and all that, he could have them come in for short rehearsals, and he knew what each one of them could do. And within 4 hours, they had a finished recording.
Yeah, and it was one of the few times you heard a director actually admitting that the actors were who he relied on to save this, because there was simply nowhere near the support that there was a decade before, or even especially 2 decades before. So they all knew by then. They were kind of waiting for the guillotine to drop, and say, all right, that's the end. It's all finished. Television has won decisively.
Right. And it's interesting to see the script credits for some of those New York shows, because Bill Robeson's still writing scripts.
He was so bitter about the fact that one week it was Hollywood and suddenly New York took over, and yet he couldn't resist. The radio was in his blood, so he kept writing scripts and submitting them. A couple of them were reuses of like Night on Red Mountain, which was a great story he did in the 50s. It was pretty much the end. And there's some really good ones. There was a funny one with Jackson Beck playing a gangster. And they were slick professional productions, but they sure didn't have all the production values of the great years in Hollywood.
No. Yeah. They even snuck some Mysterious Traveler scripts in there.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So that was another thing, of course, about old time radio, is the constant reuse of scripts from one series to another, and it's really easily explained by the fact that the writers' union back then had a clause where the writer could revert, the rights to the script would revert to him in terms of the actual literary stuff, although the production remained the property of CBS, for instance. But then they were free to peddle that script again to another mystery show a few years down the track. That's why you'll hear, as Joe says, Mysterious Traveler, Murder by Experts, and some of these New York shows, even Radio City Playhouse and shows like that would use some of the West Coast scripts that we'd known on things like Suspense and Escape.
Zach, do you have any questions?
No, I think we've gotten a plethora of wonderful information from.
Keith, we've got a plethora. How did this happen?
I think we've covered a lot more than I would have expected to, but I do have one question in regards to the pilot, because I'm a Hitchcock fan. Um, what's it like listening to that in a world where you've consumed most of where suspense really got tooled to its perfection? Like, can you listen to that like without like judging it too harshly, or is it still read just as a pilot for you?
I think it's a totally different concept that they were trying to work with, because they wanted the show to have Alfred Hitchcock as the host.
Right. Yeah.
It was going to be something much different than what they had.
Yeah.
Now we've found some newspaper clips that it seems that I think her name was Joan Harrison, who was the secretary and one of the most important people in the Hitchcock business, that she actually wrote that script.
Yeah.
So it's it was a concept that could have worked at that time, but when Hitchcock did not show up for the production because he had other stuff to do,
Yep.
I think at that time the standard was Cecil B. DeMille, who showed up every week, and if Hitchcock isn't going to show up every week, then what good is he?
Yeah.
You know.
And they screwed it up with that corny ending where the bad impersonation of Hitchcock. A lot of it had to do with the fact that the original plan was to have Hitchcock there, but suddenly he was called to New York because of the premiere of Rebecca, his movie.
Yep.
And he did manage to get into the New York CBS studio to listen to the broadcast, because he was originally, the big plan was, if the show had picked up a sponsor, Hitch was going to be the host like DeMille.
Right.
And but then again, in my opinion, listening to that show just as a once-off, and it is, fortunately, it survives in excellent sound. I can see why Bill Spear was attracted to it, because as a production, up until say the first 25 minutes, the drama of the actual lodger story is very well done, and Herbert Marshall and Edmund Gwenn are great, and so is Lorene Tuttle. And I could see that these guys like Charles Vander and Bill Spear could see that many of the aspects of suspense were already present in that pilot, like the very dramatic use of music cues and just a general feeling of theatrical class about it.
Yeah.
I think one of the worst decisions for that show was when Hitchcock is listening in New York. He brings a radio critic into the studio with him, and they're listening to it together.
Yeah, Alton Cook, and it got a panning review. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that sounds like Hitch. Do something maudlin to ease out the comfort. I have a feeling that even if he was going to do it, the question is, would David O. Selznick let him out for more than 5 minutes at that time?
Yes, and also my feeling would be that at least Cecil B. DeMille spoke at a normal pace. If Hitchcock had become the host of Suspense, 15 minutes of it would have been that sort of introduction.
No, Hitch, we've got to pace this up. This is radio. Yes. No, I'm going to talk in this register. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joe Webb, Mr. Keith Scott. It's always
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. And Walden,
here,
thank you
Zach.
so much for moderating this. This has been a treat,
Same.
guys. This is an absolute
Thanks, Walden
Yeah.
and Zach. It's always
I have to
great
call a doctor, see if there's a cure for plethora.
incurable.
Actually, I thought the word plethora meant an unhealthy amount, which actually suits Suspense.
700 episodes? What?
Oh.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much,
Okay.
gentlemen.